He grabbed her collar in front of everyone. Sergeant Michael Grayson's hand closed around the fabric of Emily Carter's uniform, like he was picking up something that didn't belong there, like she didn't belong there. And every single one of the 390 recruits standing on that field held their breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because when a man with that many medals decides to make an example out of you, most people look away. Emily didn't. If this story moves you, please subscribe, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very last word. She was 24 years old and she carried grief the way some people carry old photographs quietly close to the chest, never quite letting anyone else see the full picture. Emily Carter had driven herself to Fort Campbell, Kentucky on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Her hands steady on the wheel and her jaw set in the particular way her mother always recognized as the expression that meant Emily had already made up her mind and there was no point arguing. The world outside the car was still cool, the kind of cool that reminded you winter wasn't completely finished yet, and the trees along the highway were just beginning to think about turning green again. Emily noticed none of it. She was thinking about her brother. His name was Daniel Carter, and he had been 26 years old when he died overseas. He had been the kind of man who laughed easily and apologized sincerely and always knew where the nearest exit was in any room he walked into because Daniel had been careful the way only people who truly love living tend to be careful. The Army had taught him that. Or maybe he had always been that way, and the Army simply confirmed it. Emily had spent 2 years after his funeral trying to figure out the difference, and she had never quite settled the question. What she had settled was this: she was going to finish what Daniel started. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because she thought it would bring him back. But because when you love someone who died doing something they believed in, sometimes the only way to honor that love is to walk into the same fire and refuse to flinch. So she parked her car, picked up her bag, and walked through the gates of Fort Campbell like she had every right in the world to be there. Because she did. The first thing Emily noticed about basic training was the noise. Not the shouting she had expected the shouting. She had watched enough videos, read enough accounts, talked to enough veterans, that she knew the shouting was part of the machinery, a tool designed to disorient and pressure test and strip away the comfortable civilian assumption that you could take your time making decisions. No, what surprised her was the noise underneath the shouting, the constant, layered, relentless sound of hundreds of people discovering the edges of themselves at exactly the same time. It was almost musical in a brutal sort of way. Emily found her rack, stowed her gear, and introduced herself to the recruit sleeping in the bunk beside hers. His name was Jordan Mitchell, and he had a wide grin and the kind of easy confidence that comes from growing up in a large family where you had to earn your voice at the dinner table every single night. "Where are you from?" Jordan asked, extending a hand. "Columbus," Emily said. "Ohio." "Army family," she hesitated, just half a second. "My brother was." Jordan nodded like he understood that the past tense carried weight, and he didn't ask any follow-up questions, which immediately made Emily like him. "I'm from Savannah," he said. "Third-generation Army. My grandfather served in Vietnam. My dad did 2 tours in Iraq. My uncles, my cousins, at every Thanksgiving, somebody's wearing a uniform." He smiled, but there was something complicated in it. Lot to live up to. "Yeah," Emily said, "I know exactly what you mean." They shook hands, and Emily thought, this one is a good person. She had always been a quick judge of character, not the snap judgments that come from prejudice, but the slower, more careful kind that comes from paying close attention to how someone treats the moment right after they introduce themselves. Jordan's handshake was firm without being performative. His eye contact was genuine. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was just being real. In a place where real was going to become increasingly precious, that mattered. The first week of training was exactly what Emily had prepared for. Physically demanding, mentally exhausting, designed to humble people who had been walking around with the comfortable assumption that they were already tough enough. Emily was not the strongest recruit in her unit. She knew this, and it didn't embarrass her because she had never claimed to be the strongest. She was methodical. She was precise. She studied everything twice. When she failed at something, and in the first week she failed at several things, she went over every failure in her mind with the same careful attention she used to give her college coursework, identifying the specific point where the error occurred and building a plan to eliminate it. She would later understand exactly the kind of behavior that made Sergeant Michael Grayson notice her. She first saw him on the fourth day. I was 41 years old with the kind of face that had been weathered by actual experience rather than age alone. The deep lines around his eyes weren't from squinting into the sun. They were from years of watching things happen that he had to decide how to respond to, and some of those responses had cost him. He wore his decorations with the quiet authority of a man who had genuinely earned them, and when he moved through a formation, recruits straightened without being told to because something in the way he carried himself communicated that he was not a person who issued warnings twice. Emily watched him the way she watched everything carefully without making it obvious. He caught her watching and held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. In most circumstances, that would mean nothing. Instructors looked at recruits. It was literally their job. But something about those 3 seconds felt different. She couldn't have said exactly what. It was the kind of instinct that most people had learned to dismiss because they couldn't prove it, and Emily had learned from her brother that dismissing instincts was one of the more reliable ways to end up in trouble. She filed it away and kept moving. By the end of the first week, Sergeant Grayson had corrected Emily 6 times in public. This was not by itself unusual. Corrections happened constantly in basic training. The entire system was built on correction. But Emily noticed something that began bothering her, the way a sound from another room bothers you when you can't quite identify it, a persistent awareness that something was slightly off. Every one of Grayson's corrections had been directed at her in front of the maximum possible number of people. Not just in front of her unit, in front of other units. During formation drills, when half the training company was assembled. During meals when recruits from 3 different platoons were present. During one particular moment on the obstacle course when every single active recruit at Fort Campbell happened to be watching. The corrections themselves were not remarkable. Your form was wrong. Your positioning was off. Your response time was inadequate. All of them were technically legitimate critiques that any instructor might deliver to any recruit. But Emily noticed that when other recruits made identical errors, and she watched closely enough to know that they did, Sergeant Grayson delivered the correction quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Only with Emily did the correction become a performance. She lay in her rack that Friday night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sound of 20 other people breathing in the rhythms of exhausted sleep. And she thought carefully about what she was observing. There were 2 explanations. Either she was genuinely worse at the things she was being corrected for than she understood herself to be, in which case the solution was to improve until the correction stopped. Or something else was happening, something with a different logic and a different purpose, and the solution was entirely different. She was not yet certain which explanation was correct. But she knew how to find out. She reached under her pillow, pulled out the small notebook she had tucked there, clicked on a pen light and wrote, Day 7, corrections received. 6. Corrections observed for similar errors by other recruits. 11. Grayson's correction method for other recruits, private brief. Grayson's correction method for me, public extended. Sample size too small to conclude pattern. Continue observing. She clicked off the light and tucked the notebook away. In the bunk across from her, Jordan Mitchell opened one eye in the darkness. You okay? He whispered. Fine, she whispered back. Just thinking. You think a lot, he said. Yeah, she agreed. I know. There was a pause. My grandfather used to say that thinking was the most dangerous thing a soldier could do, Jordan said quietly, because once you really start thinking, you can't stop. Emily stared at the ceiling. Your grandfather was right, she said. The second week was when the pressure began to feel less like training and more like something else. Emily came back from morning PT to find her bunk in a state of disciplinary disarray, technically within the parameters of a standard inspection, but there was something in the precision of the mess that felt intentional. Every item had been displaced in a way that would require the maximum amount of time to correct before the next inspection, but none of it crossed a line that would allow her to formally complain. She spent 45 minutes fixing it and said nothing. During a weapons maintenance session, she was pulled from her assigned station and placed at a workstation where the cleaning equipment was incomplete. She requested the missing components and was told by the supply officer, who looked mildly uncomfortable with the instruction he was clearly relaying from someone else, that she would need to complete her maintenance with what was available. She completed it anyway, improvising with the available materials in a way that took longer but produced acceptable results. She documented both incidents. She noted the time, the location, the names of anyone present, the specific details of what occurred, and critically she noted what she could not yet prove but could objectively observe the pattern. On the third day of the second week, something happened that shifted everything. Emily was walking back from the mess hall with Jordan, and as they passed one of the administrative buildings, a recruit named Sophie Torres fell into step beside them. Sophie was compact and intense with the kind of energy that suggested she had been running at full speed for most of her life. And she looked at Emily with an expression that mixed sympathy with something closer to warning. "Can I talk to you?" Sophie said, not to Jordan, to Emily specifically. "Sure," Emily said. Jordan read the moment correctly and said he'd catch up with them later. When he was out of earshot, Sophie said, "I need you to know something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you this because I think you're smart enough to actually use it, and I don't want to watch what happened to the others happen to you." Emily stopped walking. "What others?" Sophie lowered her voice. Not because anyone was nearby, but out of the ingrained reflex of someone who had learned to be careful about being overheard. "Before you got here, there were two other recruits, a woman named Diane Walsh and a man named Victor Reyes. Different cycles, different units, but the same instructor." Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. "Grayson." Sophie nodded. "Diane quit in the third week. She said the stress was too much, that she had realized she wasn't cut out for it. Victor was removed from the program for what his paperwork called documented failure to meet conduct standards." Sophie paused. "I knew Victor. He had the cleanest record of anyone in his cycle before it started, and then suddenly he didn't." Emily was very still. "How do you know this?" "Because I make it my business to know things," Sophie said. "I ask questions. I talk to people. I found out." She looked at Emily directly. "And I'm telling you because I've been watching Grayson watch you, and I've seen that look before." "What look?" "The look that says he's already decided how this ends," Sophie said, "and he's just building the path to get there." Emily stood in the cold spring air and felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger, but contained elements of both, plus something harder and more focused underneath. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Sophie said. "Just be smarter than the last two." Emily walked back to her rack alone, sat down and opened her notebook. She didn't write about the conversation right away. She sat with it for a moment, letting it settle, letting her mind work the way it always worked best, not in fast reactive bursts, but in the slow, methodical way of someone laying tiles on a floor, making sure each one was level before moving to the next. Then she wrote, "New information, not isolated incidents. Pattern predates my arrival. Minimum 2 documented prior cases. Method consistent, build administrative case that cannot be formally challenged. Outcome removal without obvious cause. Strategic insight, the purpose is not to discipline. The purpose is to discourage, and when discouragement fails to build a paper trail that removes the problem quietly. Counter strategy, eliminate every legitimate ground for criticism. And document everything, because if a record is being built against me, I will build a better one." She closed the notebook. Then she did something that would prove months later to be one of the most important decisions she made. She found the Base Equal Opportunity Office, asked about the formal complaint process, and submitted a preliminary concern report. Not a formal complaint, not yet, because she didn't have enough documented evidence to support a formal complaint, but a preliminary notification that said, in the careful bureaucratic language the form required, "I am observing a pattern of differential treatment and wish to establish a record of that observation." The officer who received it was a quiet woman with careful eyes named Lieutenant Mora. She read Emily's form with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained. If you were paying close attention, a very slight tightening at the corner of the mouth that suggested she had heard variations of this before. "You understand," Lieutenant Mora said, "that a preliminary report is not a formal complaint." "I understand," Emily said. "You understand that without documented evidence of a specific violation, a preliminary report has limited formal impact." "I understand," Emily said. "That's why I'm treating this as documentation that I observed a pattern on this date. I'm not asking you to act yet. I'm asking you to note that I was here." Lieutenant Mora looked at her for a long moment. Then she stamped the form and said, "Noted." Emily thanked her and walked back out into the afternoon. She felt for the first time since arriving at Fort Campbell something that approached steadiness, not safety. She wasn't naive enough to believe she was safe. She was a 24-year-old recruit who had just filed a preliminary concern report against a decorated combat veteran in a system that had been built over many decades to reinforce the authority of decorated combat veterans. But she had done something important. She had established a timestamp. She had made herself a little bit harder to erase. And in a battle where the primary weapon being used against her was the quiet removal of her legitimacy, that timestamp was the beginning of a counterattack. Jordan found her that evening after chow, and she told him what she had done. Not all of it. She wasn't ready to share everything yet, but enough that he would understand why she was asking him the questions she needed to ask. Jordan, she said, I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me, not just supportive. He set down his fork. Okay. Have you noticed anything different about how Grayson treats me compared to the rest of us? Jordan was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer. The quiet of someone who had an answer they were deciding whether to say out loud. Yeah, he finally said, I've noticed. Tell me what you've noticed. He picked up his fork, looked at it, set it back down. He rides you harder. When he corrects other people, it's fast, it's done, they move on. When he corrects you, it feels like he stopped. Like what? Like he's making a point, Jordan said, but not to you, to everyone else watching. Emily nodded slowly. That's what I see too. Jordan looked at her. What are you going to do about it? I'm going to keep doing my job, Emily said, better than anyone else, every single day. And she picked up her own fork, and I'm going to write everything down. Jordan studied her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. My grandfather, he said, used to say that the most dangerous soldier in any army was the one who kept records. Emily looked up. Jordan was looking back at her with something in his eyes that wasn't just respect. It was recognition. I'm in, he said quietly. Whatever you need me to see, I'll see it. Whatever you need me to remember, I'll remember it. Emily felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was pulled tight. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Jordan said. And the echo of Sophie's words was so exact that Emily almost smiled. Just tell me what you need. The third week brought new pressure, but Emily had begun to find something like a rhythm inside it. Every morning she got up before anyone else and spent 20 minutes reviewing her notes from the day before, looking for gaps, adding context, flagging anything she wanted to verify with a second witness. Every evening she spent 10 minutes doing the same thing in reverse, writing the day's observations before sleep could soften the edges of her memory. She had decided, going to give Sergeant Grayson anything to legitimately use against her. This required a particular kind of discipline that was different from the physical discipline of basic training. Physical discipline was about endurance, pushing through pain and fatigue until your body accepted that it could do more than your comfortable self had believed. This was about precision, maintaining an error rate so close to zero that no criticism could find a real foothold, even if it was looking for one. It was exhausting in a different way. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from constant vigilance. But Emily had been exhausted before. She had been exhausted for 2 years after Daniel died, getting up every morning and going through the motions of a life that felt slightly emptied, and she had done it anyway. She had done it the way Daniel would have done it, methodically, one day at a time, without the comfort of certainty that it would get better, just the faith that doing nothing was not an option she was willing to choose. This felt in some ways similar. On the Tuesday of the third week, during a formation drill in the early afternoon, Sergeant Grayson paused in front of Emily during an inspection and stood there for slightly longer than any inspection required. Emily stood at attention. Her rifle was correctly positioned. Her uniform was regulation. Her posture was exact. She had checked all three twice before forming up. Carter, Grayson said. Sergeant, she replied. Your response time during this morning's PT assessment was below standard. This was not true. She knew it was not true because she had clocked herself, and she had also noted that 2 other recruits had posted slower times without comment. But in the middle of a formation in front of her unit, the correct response was not to argue. I'll work to improve, Sergeant, she said. See that you do, he said, because the record I'm building on you isn't going to look good when review time comes around. He moved on. Emily stood perfectly still. Around her, she was aware of the recruits on her left and right, having heard exactly what she had heard. Not just a correction, but something more specific and more deliberate. Not you need to improve, but the record I'm building on you. That night, she wrote in her notebook, third week Tuesday. During afternoon formation inspection, Grayson made reference to the record I'm building on you. This was heard by at least 4 recruits in immediate proximity. This is the first time he has made explicit reference to an administrative record in a public setting. This is significant because it moves the pattern from behavior I am observing to behavior he is openly acknowledging. Witnesses: Jordan Mitchell, immediate left; Sophie Torres, 3 positions, right; 2 others to be identified by name. She paused. Then she added, he is no longer trying to hide it. He either believes he doesn't need to, or he has miscalculated how many people are paying attention. She closed the notebook. In the bunk beside hers, Jordan whispered in the dark, you heard that too, right? What he said about the record. I heard it, Emily said. That was... Jordan stopped. That was different. That wasn't normal instructor stuff. No, Emily agreed. It wasn't. There was a long pause. Jordan said, and the nickname surprised her slightly. She hadn't given him permission to use it, but she found she didn't mind. What happens if this goes wrong? She thought about Daniel, about the last phone call they'd had 2 weeks before he deployed, about the way he had said, almost as an aside, the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to take something from you is pretend they're not doing it. Then I'll have documentation of exactly how it went wrong, she said. And that will matter to someone, even if not here, then somewhere, eventually. Jordan was quiet for a moment. That's a pretty long game, he said. Yeah, Emily said. It is. Another pause. I'm still in, he said. I know, she said. By the end of the 3rd week, Emily had noticed something new. She was not the only one who had started paying attention. Sophie Torres, who Emily had initially read as someone sharing information out of conscience, turned out to be observing the situation with the same careful, systematic attention that Emily herself was bringing to it. Sophie had her own notebook. She had her own timestamps. She had in fact been tracking Grayson's behavior for longer than Emily had been at Fort Campbell, because Sophie's cycle had overlapped with Victor Reyes's, and Sophie had watched what happened to Victor with the particular helpless frustration of someone who had seen it clearly and not known what to do with what she was seeing. You have the Reyes cycle notes, Emily asked when Sophie showed her. Everything I documented, Sophie said. It's not much. I didn't know I was supposed to be keeping records. I was just writing things down because they bothered me and I didn't know what else to do with them. Emily looked at the notebook. Sophie's observations were less methodical than hers, more emotional in their framing, but they were real and they were dated, and they described behaviors that matched the pattern Emily was tracking with a consistency that felt like confirmation arriving late. Can I make copies of these? Emily asked. What for? Because, Emily said carefully, right now we have one thread. When this comes apart, and it will come apart one way or another, I want to have more than one thread to pull. Sophie studied her. You really think this is going somewhere? I think it's already going somewhere, Emily said. The only question is who gets to decide where it ends up. Sophie handed over the notebook. Make your copies, she said, and then tell me what to do next. Emily thought for a moment. Keep watching, she said. Keep writing. And when the moment comes that someone with actual authority asks you what you saw, tell them everything. Exactly as you wrote it. Don't soften it. Don't perform it. Just say what you know. Sophie nodded. She looked steadier somehow after hearing it said out loud. Emily understood that feeling. There was something about deciding to tell the truth, actually deciding it, not just hoping to stumble toward it, that made the ground feel firmer under your feet. Not safer, not easier, just firmer, like you had found the actual surface under all the uncertain terrain you had been navigating, and now at least you knew what you were standing on. It was in the 4th week that Tyler Chen arrived. He transferred in from another cycle, a medical hold that had delayed his training start date, and he was assigned to Emily's unit on a Wednesday afternoon, dropped his gear at an empty rack 2 down from Emily's, and within 48 hours had made 2 observations about Sergeant Grayson that he shared with nobody, because Tyler's approach to uncomfortable realities was to hold them close and think hard before he decided whether to speak. Emily noticed him noticing things. She was good at noticing people who were noticing things because she had trained herself to watch for exactly that, the particular quality of attention that looked like something other than attention if you weren't paying close enough attention yourself. She approached Tyler on the Friday of his first week after evening chow, while Jordan was in the washing area, and they had a brief window of relatively private space. Tyler, she said. He looked up. You've been watching Grayson, she said. Not an accusation, just a fact. Tyler held her gaze. I was 26, compact and precise in his movements, with the measured quality of someone who had learned early that speaking too quickly could cost you. Maybe, he said. You've seen something, she said. He was quiet. I'm not asking you to do anything with it, she said. I'm not asking you to take any risk right now. I'm just asking you to know that if you've seen something, you don't have to keep carrying it alone. Something shifted in Tyler's face. Not much, just enough. My family, he said after a moment, went through something. When I was a kid, somebody in my dad's workplace was doing something wrong, and my dad knew and he reported it, and then nothing happened to the person who was doing wrong, and everything happened to my dad. He paused. So I grew up believing that speaking up was the right thing to do in theory, and the most dangerous thing you could do in practice. Emily looked at him steadily. I grew up believing the same thing, she said, until I realized that the alternative, staying quiet and watching it keep happening, had a cost too. It just took longer to arrive. Tyler was still for a moment. Then he said, "What are you doing about Grayson?" She told him. Not everything, but enough. When she finished, Tyler sat quietly for a while. Then he said, "I'll tell you what I've seen, and I'll write it down in case it ever matters to someone." It will matter, Emily said. You can't know that, he said. No, she agreed, but I know that doing nothing guarantees it won't. Tyler Chen looked at Emily Carter in the fading evening light of the barracks, with the sound of Fort Campbell settling into its nighttime rhythms all around them, and he made the decision that quiet people who have held their observations too long always feel both relieved and terrified to make. Okay, he said, I am in. That night, Emily sat alone with her notebook and wrote for a long time. She wrote about Daniel, not formally, not in the careful documentary language she used for her observations, but just personally, the way you write things you need to say to someone who can no longer hear you. She wrote, I don't know if what I'm doing is going to work. I don't know if it's going to protect me. I don't know if the system here is capable of correcting itself, or if the people who should be watching already know and don't care. But I know you would have told me to be careful and thorough and honest, and to make sure whatever record I built was clean enough that nobody could argue with it. So that's what I'm doing. I'm building the cleanest possible record of a pattern that somebody really doesn't want to be seen. And I'm not alone anymore. I have Jordan and Sophie and Tyler and Lieutenant Mora's timestamp, and a growing set of dated observations that will be very difficult for someone to dismiss if they ever reach the right set of eyes. She paused. Then she wrote, I think that's enough to keep going. She closed the notebook. Around her, the barracks breathed in the dark. Somewhere outside Fort Campbell, settled into the deep quiet of a military post at night, that particular silence that wasn't really silence at all, but was rather the layered sound of a place that never fully stopped, machinery and routines, and the ever-present awareness that training was always preparation for something real. Emily lay back on her rack and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the moment earlier in the week when Grayson had said publicly in front of witnesses the words that had changed the nature of what she was dealing with. The record I'm building on you. She thought about what it meant that he had said it so openly. He believed he was untouchable. He had been doing this long enough to enough people successfully enough that he had stopped feeling the need to be careful about it. He had miscalculated. Because Emily Carter was not Diane Walsh, and she was not Victor Reyes, and she was not any of the others who had come before her and faced this and had not known how to build the thing that would outlast the pressure being applied to them. Emily was something Grayson had not yet encountered. She was a person who had already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing. Daniel was gone. That had already happened. The worst had already happened. And when the worst has already happened, the fear of the worst loses its power over you. That was what she was, Emily realized. She was a person who had learned that grief, when you truly sat down with it and let it teach you something, could become the most specific and durable kind of courage. Not the courage that comes from never being afraid. The courage that comes from knowing exactly what you're afraid of, knowing you survived it, and choosing to walk forward anyway. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow there would be more training, more pressure, more public corrections designed to build a record against her. She would meet every single one of them with the same discipline, the same precision, the same meticulous attention to her own performance. And she would write down everything she saw. Because the truth Emily Carter had understood since she was old enough to understand anything that mattered was only as powerful as the record you kept of it. And she was building the most careful record of her life. The 5th week of training began on a Monday, and by Tuesday afternoon, Emily Carter understood that something had changed in the way Sergeant Grayson was approaching her. It wasn't more aggressive. That was the part that surprised her. She had expected after the formation moment where he had said the words, "The record I'm building on you," out loud in front of witnesses, that the pressure would escalate into something louder, something more obviously hostile, something that would be easier to document because it would be easier to see. Instead, it became quieter. And quieter, Emily had learned from her brother a long time ago, was almost always more dangerous than loud. The shift was subtle enough that anyone who hadn't been paying the specific kind of attention Emily had trained herself to pay would have missed it entirely. Grayson stopped making his public corrections theatrical. He stopped lingering in front of her during inspections. He stopped raising his voice when he addressed her. From a distance, from the perspective of someone who had not been watching the pattern build, it would have looked like things had settled down. Like maybe the new recruit had found her footing and the tough instructor had acknowledged it. But Emily was not watching from a distance. She was watching from the inside, and from the inside, what she saw was this: Grayson had shifted strategies. He was no longer trying to break her in public. He was now doing something more methodical, more patient, and significantly more difficult to counter. He was building paperwork. The first sign came on Wednesday of the 5th week, when Emily's unit sergeant, a different instructor, a man named Staff Sergeant Holloway, who Emily had generally read as fair, if demanding, pulled her aside after morning PT with an expression that managed to be simultaneously apologetic and uncomfortable. "Carter," he said, "I need to go over your week 4 evaluation with you." Emily stood straight. "Of course, Sergeant." Holloway held the evaluation form and read from it with the particular flatness of someone reading language they did not write. Week 4 assessment notes: Carter demonstrates inconsistency in execution under pressure situations. Leadership indicators are below expected threshold for training stage. Attitude toward senior instruction has been characterized as resistant. Emily said nothing for exactly 3 seconds, which was the amount of time it took her to process what she was hearing and decide on her response. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "can I ask which specific incidents generated those characterizations?" Holloway looked at the form. He looked at it for slightly longer than was necessary for someone who had already read it. "The evaluation doesn't reference specific incidents," he said. "It's a general assessment." "A general assessment," Emily repeated, "not with hostility, just with precision. Sergeant, I've been tracking my own performance metrics since arrival. My PT scores have improved each week. My weapons qualifications are above baseline. I have no formal disciplinary notations." She paused. "A general assessment without specific incidents makes it very difficult for me to understand what I need to correct." Holloway looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, not quite sympathy, but something in the territory between the two. "I hear you, Carter," he said, and the slight weight on those 4 words told her that he heard more than just her question. "I'll note that you requested specifics." He walked away with the form, and Emily stood alone in the morning cool, and she felt something that she had been managing carefully for weeks rise up in her chest like pressure behind a closed door. She did not let it show on her face, but she walked directly to her rack, sat down, and wrote in her notebook with a hand that was slightly less steady than usual. Week 5, Wednesday. Week 4 evaluation contains 3 subjective characterizations: inconsistency under pressure below threshold leadership indicators, resistant attitude towards senior instruction. No specific incidents cited. Evaluation language is vague and non-falsifiable, impossible to correct because it describes impressions rather than behaviors. This is the administrative mechanism. This is how it works. Holloway read the evaluation with discomfort. He did not write it. Source of evaluation language: almost certainly Grayson. She paused, then she added, "This is the move I was waiting for. The public pressure was a distraction. The paperwork is the actual weapon." Jordan sat down beside her. He had been a few steps behind her when Holloway stopped her close enough to hear most of the conversation. "That evaluation," he said quietly. "I know," Emily said. "That's not what your week 4 looked like. I was there for all of it." "I know," she said again. "So what do you do?" She looked at her notebook. "I go back to Lieutenant Mora," she said, "and I update my preliminary report to include this evaluation, the date it was delivered, the absence of specific incidents to support its characterizations, in the name of the instructor who delivered it. Jordan was quiet for a moment. And then, and then I keep training, she said. Because here's the thing about paperwork that's built on general impressions rather than specific incidents. It's hard to defend in front of someone who asks the right questions, but I have to give them the right questions to ask, which means I need everything documented. She stood up. I have to go find Maura, she said. Jordan caught her arm lightly. Be careful, he said. Going back to the EO office again is going to get noticed. She looked at him. Jordan, they already noticed me the day I walked in there the first time. The question isn't whether they know I'm building a record. The question is whether my record is better than theirs. She left. Lieutenant Mora received Emily's update with the same careful neutrality she had brought to their first meeting. But this time there was something additional in her expression, a quality of alertness, as though the incoming information was connecting to something she had already been thinking about. An evaluation without specific incident citations, Mora said, making a note. Correct, Emily said. 3 subjective characterizations, each of which is impossible to specifically address because they don't reference any particular behavior or event. Mora made another note. And you're updating your preliminary report to include this. Yes, Emily said. I'm also requesting that the update be timestamped the same way the initial filing was. Mora looked up from the form. She held Emily's gaze for a moment. You've done this before, Mora said. It wasn't quite a question. No, Emily said. But I learned from someone who taught me that when someone is trying to make you disappear, the first thing you do is make sure people know you were here. Here, Mora stamped the update form. Noted, she said. Then in a tone that crossed a professional line, so briefly it was almost deniable, she said, You're doing the right things, Carter. Keep doing them. Emily walked back to training with something new settled in her chest. Not confidence exactly, she had not earned confidence. Yet she was nowhere near the end of this, but something adjacent to it. The specific calm of knowing that she was executing her plan correctly, that each piece was where it was supposed to be, that the structure she was building was solid enough to hold weight when weight came to bear on it. She needed it to hold weight, because the weight was coming. Thursday of the 5th week, Grayson conducted a rifle inspection. Not unusual. Rifle inspections happened regularly, but this one had been scheduled with less than an hour's notice, which meant it caught several recruits in various states of mid-process maintenance weapons, partially disassembled components in various stages of cleaning, not yet reassembled to inspection standard. Emily's rifle was fully assembled and clean. She had developed the habit after the supply station incident in week 2 of maintaining her rifle at inspection standard at all times, not just before announced inspections, but continuously. It required an extra 20 minutes of maintenance each day. Maintenance she fit into the margins of the schedule where other recruits were resting, but she had decided the 20 minutes was worth it. Grayson moved through the formation. He was efficient, clinical, running through the inspection with exactly the precision his reputation said he would bring to it. He reached Emily. He took her rifle, examined it, and Emily stood at attention with her eyes forward and her breathing measured and her internal state carefully locked behind the neutral expression she had spent weeks learning to maintain under exactly this kind of scrutiny. He handed the rifle back. He didn't say anything. He moved on to the next recruit. Emily stood very still and processed what had just happened. He hadn't found anything wrong, and he hadn't acknowledged that he hadn't found anything wrong. No criticism, but no acknowledgement either. She was invisible when her performance was correct and amplified when it gave him anything to work with. She wrote it down that night, week 5, Thursday. Rifle inspection, less than 1 hour's notice. Emily's rifle, no faults noted, no acknowledgement of no faults. Pattern consistent, legitimate performance is ignored. Legitimate performance is not the goal. Then without planning to, she wrote, Daniel, you were right. The point was never to be perfect. The point was to become someone they couldn't erase. I think I'm getting there. She stopped. Read it back. Then closed the notebook and lay down. The next morning, Tyler Chen came to her with something in his expression that she recognized immediately as the look of a person who had been carrying information for longer than was comfortable. I need to tell you something, he said. They found a corner of the common area with some degree of privacy, and Tyler sat down and folded his hands in the way he did when he was organizing his thoughts into a shape he trusted. Last night, he said, I was in the corridor near the instructor offices. I wasn't trying to overhear anything. I was just passing through. He paused. I heard Grayson talking to someone. I don't know who. I couldn't see, but I heard Grayson say something, and I've been sitting on it for 12 hours trying to decide if I should tell you. Emily waited. He said, Tyler stopped, started again. He said she's been to the EO office twice. Twice. That's a problem we need to address before it becomes a formal complaint. The air in the room felt very slightly different after he said it. Emily stayed perfectly still. He knows about my second visit. He knows, Tyler confirmed. Which means someone in or near that process told him, Emily said. Her voice was even. It was very deliberately even, which means I can't assume the preliminary report is protected. What does that do to your plan? Tyler asked. She thought for a moment. It changes the timeline, she said. I was planning to keep building the record before pushing for anything formal. But if he knows about the EO filings and is planning to, she used Tyler's word deliberately, address them, then I can't wait. I need another layer. What kind of layer? She looked at Tyler carefully. The kind that exists outside this base. Tyler was quiet. You mean outside the chain of command? I mean something that can't be quietly intercepted, she said. A formal JAG consultation, a written request for records review, something that creates an external timestamp that doesn't pass through anyone who reports to anyone who reports to Grayson. Tyler looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of respect, not demonstrative, not warm in the obvious way, but solid and real. That's smart, he said. It's what should have been done the first time, she said. I didn't do it because I didn't want to escalate before I had enough. But now that he knows I'm building a record waiting for more evidence is just giving him more time to build his own. She stood up. Thank you, Tyler, she said, for telling me. He nodded. Then he said, be careful who you trust in the admin section. She looked at him steadily. I'll be careful about everyone, she said, but I'll still trust the process. Because if I stop trusting the process entirely, I'm doing this alone, and alone is what he wants. She spent the next 6 hours doing her job at the highest standard she was capable of producing. Every instruction followed, every task executed, every physical requirement met or exceeded. And then in the window between afternoon PT and evening, chow, she walked to the Judge Advocate General's office on base and submitted a formal written request for a records consultation. The JAG officer who received her request was a young first lieutenant named Vasquez, who had the particular quality of brand new professional competence, still close enough to his training that he believed the process genuinely worked, not yet worn down by the accumulated experience of cases where it hadn't. Emily found this unexpectedly reassuring. She needed someone who still believed in the machinery because she needed the machinery to function. She explained what she had, the preliminary EO report, the evaluation without specific citations, the patterns she had documented, the information that Grayson was aware of her EO filings and had characterized them as a problem to be addressed. Lieutenant Vasquez listened, took notes, and asked 3 questions that told Emily he was actually following the thread and not just going through motions. When she finished, he said, you understand that a formal records consultation doesn't initiate a formal investigation. I understand, Emily said, but it does create a legal record that this consultation occurred and that you provided this information on this date. That's what I need, Emily said. Vasquez looked at his notes. The evaluation characterizations you described, resistant attitude towards senior instruction, inconsistency under pressure. These are the kind of language that tends to accumulate in training records and becomes very difficult to contest later without a contemporaneous counter record. I know, Emily said. That's why I'm here. Vasquez stamped the consultation form. Emily looked at the stamp. She now had 3 timestamps: the initial EO preliminary report, the update, and now a JAG consultation. 3 external records that documented her presence and her concerns on 3 separate dates through 3 separate channels. She was making herself harder to erase with every conversation she had. She walked back to the barracks in the fading afternoon, and Jordan was waiting at the entrance with a look on his face that told her something had happened while she was gone. What? She said. There's a formation tomorrow morning, he said. Full company, 390 recruits. Grayson is leading the inspection. Emily absorbed this. When was this announced? About 40 minutes ago, Jordan said. She nodded slowly. So approximately 40 minutes after I left to go to the JAG office. Jordan met her eyes. I don't know if those things are connected. Neither do I, Emily said. But let's assume they might be and act accordingly. What does acting accordingly look like? She thought of the formation, 390 recruits, the largest single gathering of witnesses that had occurred since she arrived at Fort Campbell. Every recruit in the training company assembled together with Grayson conducting the inspection. It looks like this, she said. Tonight I maintain my rifle until it is flawless. I lay out my uniform until it is regulation perfect. I sleep enough to be sharp in the morning, and I stand in that formation tomorrow with nothing he can legitimately criticize. And if he criticizes something anyway, Jordan asked. Emily looked at him. Then 390 people hear it, she said quietly, and that's a lot of witnesses. Jordan stared at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite alarm, but the particular alertness of someone who has just understood that the situation is further along the track than they realized. You think something is going to happen tomorrow, he said, not a question. I think, Emily said carefully, that someone who has been watching me build a record outside the base chain of command and who has decided that this is a problem to be addressed might decide that tomorrow's formation with the largest possible audience is an opportunity to make a point. She paused. I don't know what that point looks like. I don't know how far he'll go, but I know that I need to be ready for it. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that Emily had not said but had been thinking since Tyler gave her the information that morning. If something happens tomorrow, Jordan said, in front of 390 recruits, there's no version of that where it stays quiet. No, Emily agreed. There's not. She held his gaze. That might be the point, she said. Jordan went still. His or yours, he finally asked. Emily Carter looked at her friend, and for the first time since arriving at Fort Campbell, she let him see something she had been keeping below the surface. Not fear exactly, but the honest, clear-eyed knowledge of someone who has been preparing for a specific moment and now believes that moment is close. I don't know yet, she said. It depends on what he decides to do. She walked inside. That night, she laid out her uniform with the particular care of someone who knows that every detail matters when there is no room for error. And she cleaned her rifle with the slow, meditative attention she usually reserved for her nightly notes, and she wrote in her notebook. Not for the record, this time, not the careful observational language she used for documentation, but for herself. Tomorrow there will be 390 people watching. Whatever happens, I have 3 external records, 2 witnesses who have committed to telling what they know, a JAG consultation and a preliminary EO report with 2 dated updates. I have done everything I can do to be impossible to erase. I have done everything I can do to perform my job without fault. I have done everything I can do. Whatever he chooses to do tomorrow, in front of those 390 people, I will be ready. She paused for a long time. Then she wrote, Daniel, I hope I learned enough from you. She closed the notebook. Around her, the barracks went quiet, the breathing of 20 exhausted people finding the slow rhythm of sleep, and Emily lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt for the first time in 5 weeks something that was almost like calm. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had prepared everything she could prepare, and now the next move belonged to someone else, and there was a particular kind of peace in having done everything right and simply waiting to see what the truth was going to look like when it finally had enough room to show itself. She closed her eyes. In 8 hours, there would be 390 witnesses. Whatever happened next, it was not going to stay quiet. She was awake before the alarm. Not because that she couldn't sleep, but because at some point during the night, her body had made the decision that sleep was finished and there was work to be done, and Emily Carter had learned long ago not to argue with that particular signal. She lay still for 2 minutes in the dark, running through everything she had prepared, checking it the way that a pilot checks instruments before takeoff, not because she expected to find something wrong, but because the checking itself was part of the discipline. Rifle cleaned and assembled to inspection standard, the night before wrapped in its issued cloth to prevent dust contact overnight. Uniform laid out with regulation precision, every element in its correct position. Boots polished to the standard that went one level above what was required, because one level above required was the only margin she trusted. Documentation, her notebook, the copies of Sophie's notes, the JAG consultation receipt, all of it secured in the one location she had determined was outside the reach of anything a standard rack inspection could touch. Mind as clear as she could make it, which was not perfectly clear, because nothing about this morning was going to be simple, and pretending otherwise would have been a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. She got up at 0430, 45 minutes before the scheduled wake call, and she used those 45 minutes the way she had used every extra window of time since arriving at Fort Campbell, methodically, purposefully, without waste. By the time the rest of the barracks was moving, Emily Carter was ready. Jordan caught her eye across the room as recruits began the organized chaos of morning preparation. He had been awake for a while too, she could tell by the absence of that particular grogginess that even the most disciplined people carried in the first minutes after waking. He looked at her and gave a small, single nod. She nodded back. Sophie Torres was 3 racks down, moving through her own preparation with the same quiet intensity she had been bringing to everything since the conversation where she handed over her notebook. She didn't look at Emily directly, but Emily had spent enough time watching Sophie to know when Sophie was aware of her, and Sophie was absolutely aware of her this morning. Tyler Chen, 2 racks further, was already in full uniform, sitting on the edge of his rack with his hands quiet in his lap, looking at nothing in particular with the focused inward attention of someone who is not looking at nothing at all. 390 recruits, full company formation. Grayson leading the inspection. Emily picked up her rifle, checked it one final time, and walked outside into the early morning. The formation assembled at 0600 hours exactly. 309 people is a number that sounds abstract until you are standing inside it, and then it becomes something physical. A weight of human presence that you feel in the air around you. The way the space between people carries the collective tension of all of them, simultaneously waiting for something to happen. Emily stood in her assigned position in the 3rd row, Jordan on her left, a recruit named Paulson on her right, and she held her rifle at the correct position and kept her eyes forward and breathed. She was aware of Grayson before she could see him, not because of any sound he made, but because of the particular quality of attention that moved through the formation when he appeared, that collective involuntary straightening that happened without anyone deciding to do it, because Sergeant Michael Grayson had the kind of authority that moved through space ahead of him like a pressure front. He began the inspection at the far end of the formation, moving through the rows with the efficiency of a long practice. From where Emily stood, she could hear his voice, but not yet make out words, just the cadence of correction and acknowledgement, the rhythm of an inspection proceeding through its normal course. The morning air was cool and still. Emily breathed. She thought about Daniel briefly. Not the grief part, but the memory of his voice saying something she had stored away years ago and only recently begun to fully understand. He had said the moments that define you are never the ones you're ready for. You think you're ready, but what actually matters is whether you built yourself well enough that the unprepared version of you is still good enough. She had built herself. 5 weeks of discipline and documentation and early mornings, and careful, meticulous refusal to give anyone a legitimate reason to remove her. She had built herself as carefully as she knew how. She was about to find out if it was good enough. Grayson reached the 2nd row. Emily could now make out words. He was moving quickly. Corrections brief and efficient, the inspection running at a pace that suggested he was covering ground towards something rather than simply covering ground. She didn't let herself think about what that something might be. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady and her grip on her rifle exactly as regulation required. He reached her row. She felt him before she heard the footsteps stop. She was looking straight ahead, which meant she wasn't looking at Grayson, which meant she was experiencing him entirely through sound and proximity, the slight change in air pressure when he stepped in front of her, the half-second silence before he spoke. Carter. Sergeant, she said. Her voice came out exactly as she intended it, level, respectful, present. He reached out and took her rifle. Emily released it correctly, maintained her position, and waited. The inspection of the rifle took significantly longer than it had taken for any other recruit in the row. She could not time it precisely. She didn't have a watch on, but she had been in enough inspections to know when a duration was normal and when it was extended, and this was extended. By enough that the recruits immediately around her would also be aware of it. Then Grayson spoke. Unacceptable, he said. The word landed in the cool morning air with the flatness of something that had been decided before it was delivered. Emily didn't move. Sergeant, she said, keeping her voice exactly as level as before. May I ask what the specific deficiency is? The barrel shows evidence of inadequate maintenance, he said. This was not true. She had cleaned that barrel the night before and inspected it again this morning, and she knew with the specific, intimate certainty of someone who has done a thing carefully and remembers doing it, that there was no deficiency in the barrel. But she didn't say that, not yet. "I understand, Sergeant," she said. "I'll address it." He handed the rifle back, and then he didn't move on. The formation was 390 people. 390 people who were, as is the nature of human beings, standing in a large group being told to look straight ahead, not actually looking straight ahead. They were watching the way you watch something from the corner of your eye when you know you're not supposed to be watching, but something in the situation has tripped the wire of your attention and you can't quite look away. 390 people were watching Sergeant Grayson stand in front of Emily Carter and not move on. "You've been a problem," he said, not in the corrective tone of an instructor addressing a performance issue. In a different tone, personal, deliberate, the tone of someone who has decided that this moment is the moment they've been building toward. Emily stayed still. "Since your first day," he continued, "you think you're smarter than the process. You think of filing reports and running to offices is going to protect you." He let that land for a moment. "It won't, because I've been doing this for 16 years, and in 16 years, I've never had a recruit with an attitude problem and a mediocre record make it through to the end." The formation was so quiet that Emily could hear the breathing of the person standing to her right. She understood in that moment what was happening. He wasn't inspecting her rifle. He was delivering a verdict, publicly, in front of 390 witnesses. The verdict was, "You don't belong here, and I am going to prove it, and there is nothing you can do." I was doing it this way publicly out loud in front of everyone because he had decided after her JAG consultation that the quiet administrative approach was no longer sufficient. He needed to establish something more visceral, something that would be harder to challenge, something that looked like a decisive disciplinary action rather than a paper trail. He had miscalculated because Emily looked at him directly and said, "Sergeant, I need you to understand something." Everyone heard that. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded it. The previous silence was the silence of 390 people holding their breath. This silence was the silence of 390 people having collectively registered a shift in the situation that they were still processing. Grayson's expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Are you addressing me out of turn, Carter?" "I am addressing you directly, Sergeant," she said. "Because what you just said, that you've been doing this for 16 years and recruits with attitude problems don't make it through, was a statement that approximately 390 people heard, which means it is now part of a shared record." Her voice was not loud. She was not shouting. She was not angry in the way that anger looks like when it loses control. She was speaking in the clear, measured, deliberate tone of someone who has thought very carefully about what they are going to say and has decided that this is the moment to say it. Furthermore, she said, "I have submitted a preliminary concern report to the Equal Opportunity Office, which I have updated twice. I have completed a JAG records consultation. I have documented with dates and witnesses every instance of differential treatment I have received since arriving at this base. And I am telling you this out loud right now in front of these witnesses because I want there to be absolutely no ambiguity about the fact that I have done everything through official channels and in accordance with regulation." Grayson took one step closer to her. The distance between them was no longer inspection distance. It was something else. Every person in that formation felt it. "You think your paperwork protects you," he said very quietly. "In 16 years, I have watched recruits try to use the system against me. You know what happened to all of them." "I know what happened to Diane Walsh," Emily said. "And I know what happened to Victor Reyes." Something crossed Grayson's face. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But 390 people were watching, and some of them were close enough to see it. "You have no idea," he started. "I have documentation," she said, "which is better than an idea." And then he reached out and grabbed her collar. Not a shove, not a strike. A grab, fingers closing around the fabric of her uniform at the collar, a physical assertion of the power differential that had been at the center of everything for 5 weeks, a gesture that said, "I can do this. I can reach out and take hold of you in front of everyone, and nothing will happen because nothing has ever happened, because I am untouchable." 390 people froze. Not in the trained, disciplined stillness of military formation. In the spontaneous, involuntary stillness of human beings who have just witnessed something that has crossed a line they feel in their bodies before they can name it in their minds. Emily did not step back. She did not raise her hands. She did not let her face show the thing that ran through her in the first half second after his hand closed on her collar. The spike of fear, the cold surge of pure adrenaline, the animal instinct that said move. She stood absolutely still. She looked directly at him, and she said very clearly, very calmly, in a voice that carried to every person in that formation, "Witnesses are watching." 3 words. Not a challenge, not a taunt, not a threat. A statement of fact delivered with the precise, unshakable calm of someone who has been preparing for exactly this moment and has decided that the most powerful thing she can do with it is simply tell the truth about what is happening. Sergeant Michael Grayson released her collar. His hand dropped. For one complete second, nobody in the 390-person formation moved or breathed or made a sound. And then the sound came back, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the ordinary, irreversible way that reality returns, when a spell breaks, the sound of wind of boots shifting on ground, of people exhaling the breath they had been holding of the world, continuing past the moment that had just occurred. Grayson stepped back. He looked at Emily Carter standing there, collar released, eyes still on his expression, still controlled, and Emily understood, she could see it happening in real time across his face, that he had just done something that could not be undone. In 16 years, he had never touched a recruit in anger. He had never given someone a moment that could not be characterized as ambiguous. Everything before today had been deniable. The public corrections, the vague evaluation language, the whispered authority of a man who knew how to apply pressure without leaving marks. Even the words he had just spoken, taken out of context, could be argued down by someone skilled enough in bureaucratic language. But a hand on a collar in front of 390 witnesses was not ambiguous. It was not deniable. And it was witnessed by everyone. Emily held his gaze for one more second. Then she looked straight ahead again, back to the correct formation position, rifle in her hands. Posture regulation perfect, as though the last 4 minutes had been a weather event that had passed and the inspection was still in progress. Because that was the last thing she had to give him, the final demonstration of everything she had been building toward, not victory, not defiance, not the satisfaction of having been proved right. Just discipline. Just the quiet, unshakable commitment to continuing to do her job correctly while the world sorted out what had just happened. It took approximately 90 seconds for Staff Sergeant Holloway to appear at the edge of the formation. He had not been present at the beginning of the inspection. He arrived, Emily understood later, because one of the other instructors standing at the perimeter of the formation, had moved to contact him the moment Grayson's hand had closed on Emily's collar. Holloway walked to the center of the formation with the particular gait of a man who has assessed a situation in transit and has arrived with a clear understanding of what he needs to do. He said, "Sergeant Grayson," a word. Grayson turned. The two men walked to the edge of the formation, and the 390 recruits standing at attention watched them go. And the watching was not covert or uncertain, the way watching usually was in a situation governed by authority. It was open, direct, because something had shifted in the last 4 minutes, and everyone felt it, and nobody was entirely sure what to do with the feeling, but nobody was pretending they hadn't felt it either. Jordan Mitchell, 3 positions to Emily's left, exhaled slowly. Sophie Torres, 8 positions back and 2 rows over, closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Tyler Chen at the far end of the formation stood absolutely still with an expression that Emily would have recognized if she could have seen it, the expression of someone who had been holding a decision in suspension for a long time and had just watched the moment arrive that made the decision simple. Emily stood at attention and breathed. Her heart rate was elevated. She was aware of it the way you're aware of your own heartbeat after you've been running, present, measurable, real. She didn't try to slow it down. She just let it be what it was and kept breathing. Holloway came back. He stood in front of the formation and said in the flat, factual tone of a man reporting a weather condition, "Formation is dismissed. Report to your assigned PT stations. Inspection is complete." The formation broke, and as it broke, as 390 people began the organized dispersion of a dismissed formation, something happened that Emily had not planned for and had not allowed herself to expect. They came to her, not all of them, not in a crowd, not in a rush, but one by one, in the quiet, understated way that people approach each other when they have witnessed something significant and don't yet have the language for it. They came. A recruit named Marcus Webb, who Emily had spoken to maybe 4 times in 5 weeks, stopped beside her and said, "I've been here since week 2. What you said about Walsh and Reyes, I knew Walsh. I trained with her for 9 days before she disappeared. I always thought," he stopped. "I never said anything." "You can say something now," Emily said. "Usina." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "I think I can." A recruit named Kayla Simmons, who Emily recognized from her unit, but had never spoken with directly, said, "I want to know about the EO process. I want to know what you filed and how you did it." Emily looked at her. "I'll tell you everything." And Jordan was beside her suddenly, not saying anything at first, just present the way he had been present through all of it. And then he said, "You okay?" Emily thought about the question. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because Jordan had earned the unpolished version, my hands were shaking. They stopped, but they were shaking. Jordan looked at her with an expression she didn't have a precise name for, not sympathy exactly, not admiration exactly, but the specific regard of someone who has watched you do something they are not sure they could have done themselves. "Yeah," he said, "mine would have been too." Sophie appeared at Emily's other side and said without preamble, "I'm submitting my notebook, everything I documented, today." "Mora's office or JAG?" Emily asked. "Both," Sophie said. Tyler found Emily 20 minutes later, after the initial dispersal had settled, and most recruits had made their way to their assigned PT stations. He stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment, and Emily waited because she had learned that Tyler's silences meant he was sorting something. "My dad," Tyler said finally, "lost his job because he reported something and nobody backed him up. For 20 years I watched him carry that. The idea that he did the right thing, but it didn't matter because he was alone." He stopped. "I don't want to be the reason someone ends up like that. I don't want to be the person who didn't back someone up." Emily looked at him steadily. "Then don't be," she said. "I won't," he said. "I'm going to write down everything I heard in that corridor, every word. I'm going to sign it." She nodded. "Thank you, Tyler." "No," he said in the quiet, serious way that meant he had thought about this. "Thank you for being someone worth backing up." By evening, something was moving through the base that Emily could feel but not quite see, the way you feel a current in water before you can see where it's going. Recruits she had never spoken to sought her out. Some of them had specific things to report: incidents. They had witnessed patterns. They had noticed names of other recruits who had passed through Grayson's authority and come out changed. Some of them had nothing specific, just the need to say, "I saw what happened this morning, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't." One of them was a recruit named Derek Okafor, 22 years old, who had been in training for 11 weeks and was close enough to the end of his cycle that he could have stayed quiet without significant risk. He found Emily after evening chow and said, "I've been here longer than most of you. I've seen 3 cycles come through Grayson's section. I've seen what happens. I never said anything because I thought I told myself it was just how it was, that this was the army and hard was just hard, and who was I to say otherwise?" He paused. "This morning changed that," he said. "You stood there and you didn't run and you didn't fight and you didn't break, and the thing you said, witnesses are watching." He stopped again. "I want to be a witness. Whatever you need me to say, I'll say it." Emily looked at Derek Okafor, this young man she had never spoken to before today, and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but had elements of both the particular emotion of watching people choose to be better than the silence that had been asked of them. "Tell me what you saw," she said. "Exactly as you saw it. Nothing more and nothing less. Can you do that?" "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." That night, Emily sat with her notebook and wrote for a long time. She wrote the names Marcus Webb, Kayla Simmons, Derek Okafor. She wrote the 3 words Jordan had said that she was going to carry for a long time. Mine would have been too. She wrote Tyler's words about his father. She wrote Sophie's immediate decision, both offices today, with the particular appreciation she felt for people who, when they decide to act without hesitation. Then she wrote, "This morning, Sergeant Grayson stood in front of 390 people and grabbed my collar. He did it because he believed it would end something. He did it because he believed that a physical display of power in front of the maximum possible number of people would demonstrate that he was untouchable and that I was alone. Instead, it demonstrated that he had been doing this for long enough that he could no longer accurately read a situation. He thought the audience was a weapon he could use against me. He didn't understand that an audience is only a weapon if the people in it are willing to pretend they didn't see what they saw. She paused. Then she added, they weren't willing. She closed the notebook. Outside, Fort Campbell settled into its nighttime rhythms. In offices across the base, paperwork was being written. In the EO office, Lieutenant Mora had already received 2 additional statements before the close of business. In the JAG office, Lieutenant Vasquez had noted the date and begun a preliminary file. In the barracks, a recruit named Marcus Webb was writing in a notebook he had bought that afternoon, putting down in careful handwriting everything he remembered about a woman named Diane Walsh, including the specific date she had stopped appearing at morning formation and the specific reason the instructor gave, which had not been the reason Marcus had always suspected but had never said. In the bunk 2 rows over, Derek Okafor was lying awake and going through 11 weeks of memory with the slow, methodical attention of someone who has decided that what they remember matters and is trying to make sure they remember it correctly. And somewhere in the instructor section of Fort Campbell, Sergeant Michael Grayson was sitting with the knowledge, the specific, irreversible knowledge, that he had made a mistake in front of 390 people, and that 390 people had not looked away. Emily Carter stared at the ceiling in the dark. She thought about what came next, not because she could control it, not because she had a specific plan for the investigation that was now, she was fairly certain, inevitable, but because thinking carefully about what came next was what she did, and it was what had gotten her this far. She thought the hardest part isn't over. Then she thought, but I am not alone. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Campbell, that second thought was not something she was forcing herself to believe. It was simply true. The investigation didn't begin with a dramatic announcement. It began the way most things that actually matter begin, quietly in an office with paperwork and a woman who had learned precisely when to speak and when to let her documents do the speaking for her. Emily learned about it on Thursday morning, 3 days after the formation incident, 3 days after Grayson had grabbed her collar in front of 390 people, and learned what a miscalculation felt like in real time. She was finishing morning PT at 0645 when Lieutenant Mora appeared at the entrance to the training area and asked with the particular measured calm of someone delivering information they have been carefully preparing to deliver, to speak with her privately. They walked to the small consultation room off the main administrative corridor. Mora closed her. She did not sit down immediately. She stood for a moment with her hands folded in front of her, and Emily recognized that stance. It was the stance of someone organizing their delivery, making sure the words came out in the right order. Then Mora sat down and Emily sat across from her, and Mora said, "As of yesterday afternoon, your preliminary concern report has been elevated to a formal investigation." Emily sat with that. She let it land completely before she responded, because rushing a response to information this significant was the kind of thing that made you miss something important in what had just been said. "What triggered the elevation?" she asked. "Multiple factors combined," Mora said. "The incident Monday morning generated 11 independent witness statements in the 24 hours following. Those statements came through 3 separate channels: my office, the JAG office, and one directly to the installation's Inspector General. 11 statements, 24 hours, 3 independent channels from recruits who had no coordinated prior contact with each other about what to say or where to send it." She paused. "That is not a pattern this office can characterize as a single isolated event or a single recruit's subjective experience." Emily nodded slowly. She was thinking about the formation, about the specific silence that had fallen over 390 people in the half second after she said witnesses are watching, about the fact that the silence had broken not into confusion, but into a kind of clarity. Everyone simultaneously understanding what they had just seen and what it meant. "There's something else," Mora said. Emily waited. "Your documentation," Mora said. "The record you maintained from week 1. The dates, the incident descriptions, the witness names identified at the time of the incident, rather than retrospectively, the evaluation and language quoted verbatim, the pattern analysis written in real time as the pattern was developing." She paused. "We've been reviewing it alongside the formal complaint structure, and I want you to understand something. It is unusually thorough. Thorough enough that it substantially changes the evidentiary shape of what this investigation can accomplish." Emily thought about the notebook, about the pen light clicking on in the dark, about the 45-minute sessions before the barracks woke up when the only sounds were her own breathing and the scratch of her pen on paper. about the discipline of writing exactly what she saw and nothing more than what she saw, not because she wasn't angry, not because she didn't have interpretations and feelings and responses, but because she understood that a record built on documented fact was a record that could not be argued away, while a record built on documented emotion was a record that could be dismissed by anyone who wanted to dismiss it. I was building a counter record, Emily said, because I understood that a record was already being built against me, and the only way to survive that was to build one that was better. Maura looked at her steadily across the table for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a normal conversational pause. Yes, she said, that is exactly what you were doing. Another pause. And it worked. The investigation was assigned to Colonel Rebecca Hayes, a name Emily hadn't heard before Maura spoke it, and she wouldn't meet Hayes until the following Monday, 6 full days after the formation incident, 6 days during which Fort Campbell continued its ordinary operations around Emily in a way that felt slightly displaced from reality, like trying to do ordinary things in a house where something significant had recently happened and the air hadn't quite settled back to normal yet. She continued training throughout those 6 days, not just because regulation required it, because it mattered in a specific and personal way that had nothing to do with regulation. The moment she stopped meeting the standard was the moment she handed someone a legitimate justification for criticism, and a legitimate justification for criticism was the one thing she had spent 6 weeks making absolutely unavailable. She was not going to make it available now when she was this close to something real. Patterson was running the unit. Staff Sergeant Patterson, who had replaced Grayson in the training schedule without announcement or explanation, approximately 48 hours after the formation incident, and who was conducting every session with a fairness so deliberate and so consistent that it communicated without him ever addressing the situation directly, exactly what kind of contrast he understood himself to be providing. Patterson corrected errors the same way for everyone, privately specifically citing the exact deficiency in the exact standard, and then moving on cleanly without theatrical repetition or extended public emphasis. Emily watched her unit notice. She watched the gradual collective recalibration happening in real time, people discovering, through repeated exposure to the genuine article, what fair instruction actually felt like, and quietly updating their understanding of what the previous 6 weeks had and hadn't been. Jordan walked with her to meals and said very little, which was the right thing to do. He had always been good at knowing when the right support was presence rather than words. Sophie Torres submitted her complete notebook to Maura's office on Thursday afternoon, as she had committed to doing, with no alterations and no softening of the language she had used when she wrote it down months earlier. As raw observation she hadn't known what to do with. Tyler Chen spent 2 evenings in the common area writing a formal statement that was, Emily would learn weeks later, remarkable in its precision. Every incident was dated. Every word he had overheard in the corridor was reproduced as accurately as his memory could retrieve it. Every admission about what he had initially chosen not to say was followed by a clear and honest explanation of why he was now choosing to say it. Marcus Webb filled the last pages of the notebook he had started the day after the formation, writing everything he could retrieve from memory about Diane Walsh and the 9 days he had trained alongside her before she disappeared from the schedule, including specific behaviors and specific comments from Grayson during that period that Marcus had noticed and stored and never told anyone. Derek Okafor, who had 11 weeks of observation to draw from, produced the longest statement of any recruit. It covered 3 cycles, multiple recruits in specific incidents, spanning nearly 3 months. All of this was happening around Emily while she ran and qualified and trained and wrote in her notebook every night. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather forming. You can't see it directly, but you can feel the pressure changing. When she walked into Colonel Hayes's interview room on Monday morning at 0900 hours, she understood within the first 2 minutes of the exchange that Hayes was a different category of authority from anything she had encountered in the previous 6 weeks. Hayes was 53 years old, with the particular quality of someone who had been making difficult judgments for long enough that the process of making them had become invisible. You couldn't see her deciding, you only saw the decision clean and grounded and already certain of its own foundation. She asked questions the way a surgeon cuts precisely without excess motion, with a clear anatomical understanding of exactly what she was looking for and where it was located. Walk me through the first week, Hayes said. Not what you felt, what you observed. Emily walked her through it. 43 minutes of uninterrupted testimony, every incident in chronological order, every date, every witness identified by name, every piece of evaluation language quoted verbatim. She spoke in the same factual register she had used in her notebook. No emotional embellishment, no appeals for sympathy, no editorializing. Just the clean architecture of what happened and when and who was there. Hayes listened without interruption. When Emily finished, Hayes made a note and said, "In week 3, during afternoon formation, Sergeant Grayson made reference to the record I'm building on you. You noted 4 witnesses within hearing distance at that time. Jordan Mitchell immediately to my left, Sophie Torres 3 positions to my right, Marcus Reyes and a recruit named Paulson approximately 2 positions behind Torres on the right. You identified all 4 by name in your documentation at the time of the incident. Within 4 hours of the incident," Emily said, "before I spoke with any of those 4 individuals about what they had heard. I wrote the names down that evening as part of my standard nightly documentation." Hayes made another note. "Before this investigation began, did anyone advise you to document your experiences in this specific manner? Legal counsel, a family member, a prior military contact?" Emily considered the question honestly. "My brother," she said. "He was a soldier. He died overseas 2 years ago. He used to tell me that in any situation where someone is trying to take something from you, the first thing you do is make sure people know you were here. He meant it as general life philosophy." She paused. "It turned out to be operationally specific when I needed it to be." Hayes looked up from her legal pad. "Your brother's advice," she said quietly, "was operationally sound." She made one more note, and the interview continued for another 1 hour and 23 minutes. When Emily walked out, Jordan was waiting at the end of the corridor. He had been interviewed that morning and had the particular depleted quality of someone whose sustained tension has finally been released and left them emptied. "How was it?" he asked. "Long," Emily said. "She asked the right questions." "Which is better than good questions," Jordan said. "Exactly right," Emily said. Jordan fell into step beside her. She already knew things when she asked me about them. It wasn't like she was learning what I said. It was like she was verifying it against something she already had. "Other sources we don't know about yet," Emily said. "That's what I thought." She was right. Thursday of the 7th week, Maura called Emily back to the administrative wing and delivered information that reframed the entire scope of what Emily understood herself to be part of. The records review. Hayes had ordered 4 years of Grayson's training assignments pulled and systematically examined, had found something that arrived in Emily's understanding with the specific weight of a thing that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting for someone to look directly at it. 7 recruits across 4 years, different cycles, different units, different starting points, all women, all gone from the program within 4 weeks of receiving an evaluation. And in each of those evaluations, the same 3 phrases appeared: resistant attitude towards senior instruction, inconsistency under pressure, below threshold leadership indicators. The same phrases, the same sequence. 4 years, 7 people. Emily sat in Maura's office and felt something move through her that wasn't surprise, because some part of her had understood from Sophie's first warning that she wasn't the beginning of this, but was something deeper and colder than surprise. It was the specific weight of counting a real cost and finding that the number was much larger than you had understood. 7 recruits, she said, that we've identified in the initial review, Maura said carefully. All women, Emily said. Yes. All gone from the program. Yes. Emily was quiet for a moment. Did any of them try to report it? Maura's expression shifted slightly. 2 of them filed reports, she said. Both reports were closed without formal investigation within 2 weeks of filing. The room felt very still. Who closed them? Emily asked. That, Maura said, is currently an active line of the investigation. Emily absorbed that slowly and completely. She thought about those 2 women, whoever they were, whatever their names were, whatever had brought them to Fort Campbell, with the same belief Emily had carried through those gates, who had done exactly what was supposed to be done, who had filed the report, who had trusted the process, who had extended the most vulnerable kind of faith in an institution, the faith that says, I believe you will take me seriously, and had watched that faith be quietly processed and discarded and returned to them as silence. She thought about what that silence must have felt like. She thought about why she hadn't experienced that same silence. External timestamps through 3 separate channels. a JAG consultation that sat outside the base chain of command, documentation that existed in multiple copies in multiple locations. The specific foresight inherited from Daniel of making herself harder to erase before the erasure was attempted. Those two women had deserved all of that. Every recruit who had ever been in that position had deserved all of that. And they hadn't had it because nobody had told them it existed, and nobody had made sure they knew how to build it before they needed it. That thought settled into Emily Carter, like something that was going to stay. Lieutenant Mora, Emily said after a long moment. Yes. The two closed reports, are the recruits who filed them still reachable? Are they being contacted as part of the investigation? Mora looked at her. That is being considered, she said carefully. It shouldn't be considered, Emily said. It should be done. Whatever happened to them, whatever record was built against them that removed them from training, they deserve to know that someone finally looked at it. Mora was quiet for a moment. I will pass that along, she said. The following Monday brought a meeting that Emily would carry in her memory with a precision that matched the precision of her documentation. Major Linda Forsyth from the Inspector General's office sat down across from her in a consultation room and said without ceremony or preamble, I need to tell you something about the evaluation language used in your Week 4 assessment. Emily waited. The specific phrases in that evaluation-resistant attitude towards senior instruction, inconsistency under pressure, below-threshold leadership indicators. We found those exact phrases in evaluations from 4 years ago. The same three characterizations in the same sequence in language that is not merely similar, but in places word for word, identical. Emily went very still. A template, she said. We believe so, yes, Forsyth said. A pre-written construct that was applied to specific evaluations with name substitution, which means the assessment you received in Week 4 was not a genuine evaluation of your performance as a recruit. It was a pre-existing instrument with your name placed into it. Emily thought about Staff Sergeant Holloway standing in front of her, with that evaluation form reading the language, with the particular flatness of a man reciting something he hadn't written, something that sat wrong in his voice, something he delivered because he had been handed it and hadn't known what else to do with it. Holloway didn't write it, Emily said. We don't believe so, Forsyth said. That line of investigation is ongoing. Emily looked at Forsyth steadily. How many times was the template used? Forsyth met her gaze. We are still counting, she said. That night, Emily wrote for longer than she had written in any single session since arriving at Fort Campbell. She wrote about the template. She wrote about the 7 women. She wrote about the 2 closed reports. She wrote about what it meant that Holloway had read someone else's words out loud to her with the discomfort of a man who knows something is wrong, but has not yet found the courage to say so. She wrote about the specifics of the failure that allowed something like this to operate for 4 years. Not a conspiracy of active malice by many people, but the much more ordinary and therefore much more common failure of people who noticed something, felt its wrongness, and assumed that the noticing was enough, that someone else would take the next step. Nobody had taken the next step until the steps found their way to Emily Carter's notebook. She wrote, I am not angry in the way I expected to be angry. What I feel is colder and more specific than anger. It is the feeling of having counted the real cost of something and found that the number is significantly larger than I understood. 7 women, 4 years, a template, 2 closed reports. Whatever number Forsyth still counting produces at the end, that is the cost. And I want the cost to stop growing. That is the only thing I want from all of this. I want the number to stop increasing. I want the next recruit to walk into a system that cannot do this anymore because we forced it to see itself. She paused and then added, Daniel, the hardest part wasn't the formation. It wasn't Grayson grabbing my collar. It wasn't any single moment of high drama. The hardest part was the ordinary days, the days of just training and waiting and not knowing if what I was building would hold when it needed to hold. The hardest part was choosing every single morning to keep doing the work correctly when I had no guarantee that doing it correctly would be enough. I chose it anyway, because you taught me that choosing it anyway is the only version of courage that actually matters. She closed the notebook. In the bunk beside her, Jordan breathed in the slow rhythm of sleep. 4 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon in the 8th week, Staff Sergeant Aaron Daniels submitted a voluntary statement to the investigation. Maura told Emily about it the following morning and read her the relevant language because she had determined in the quiet professional evolution of their relationship across 8 weeks that Emily needed to hear it. Daniels had written, I served alongside Sergeant Grayson for 3 years across 2 assignments. During that time, I observed behaviors that concerned me and heard statements that I understood upon reflection to be inconsistent with professional standards. I did not report these observations because I assumed that individuals with greater proximity to the situations or with greater institutional authority were already aware and would act appropriately. I told myself that the system would catch what needed to be caught without my specific participation. The system did not catch it. Recruits were harmed during the period of my silence. I am submitting this statement because I understand now that my assumption was a choice and that the choice had consequences I did not intend but cannot disclaim. Emily, read those words and held them carefully the way you hold something fragile that you are not sure you know how to handle correctly. Not because Daniels' statement excused his silence. It didn't. 7 women had been removed from training during the years he had been present and observant and silent, and no statement written after the fact erased the specific cost of that specific silence during those specific years. But the statement itself was doing something. It was refusing the comfortable final position of someone who had failed to act, and then when the failure was exposed, retreated into the defensive architecture of reasons and rationalizations. Daniels was standing in front of what he had done, or rather what he had not done, and naming it clearly and accepting it without the buffer of self-justification. That was not nothing. He thought someone else would report it, Emily said. Yes, Maura said, and nobody did. Nobody did, until you. Emily thought about Tyler's father, about the specific inheritance of watching someone do the right thing and bear the cost alone with no one standing beside them. About the way that inheritance had shaped Tyler into someone who held his observations close and private, not out of cowardice, but out of the learned understanding that speaking up could cost you everything while accomplishing nothing. She thought about all the Daniel-shaped people who existed in every institution, people who were not bad people, people who experienced the discomfort of witnessing something wrong, people who told themselves the machine would function correctly without their specific input, and were ultimately wrong about that and about what it would take to change that pattern at a structural level, rather than hoping each individual would make a different choice. She went to find Tyler that afternoon. I was in the common area after PT, and when she sat down across from him, he looked at her face and said, You heard about Daniels. This morning, she said. Tyler was quiet for the moment. My dad called me last week, he said. I told him some of what had happened here, not all of it. Enough. He looked at his hands. He cried. I didn't expect that. He's not a man who cries easily. But he cried, and then he said someone finally didn't let it slide. Someone finally stayed. He looked up at Emily. He said, tell that person they gave back something I thought was gone. Emily felt that land somewhere specific and real. What did he think was gone? She asked quietly. Tyler took a breath. The idea that the system could actually work if someone made it, he said. That the process wasn't just a wall built to protect the people already inside it. He paused. He stopped believing that when nobody backed him up. He's been carrying that for 20 years. Emily nodded slowly. She thought about how far the cost of these things traveled, not just to the 7 women in Hayes' file, not just to the recruits who had trained beside them and watched them disappear, but outward and forward through years, through families, through the children of people who had been failed by a system that was supposed to catch exactly this and hadn't, leaving behind a specific and durable damage to the belief that doing the right thing was worth the risk. What changed for him? She asked. Knowing that someone didn't walk away, Tyler said simply. On Thursday afternoon of the 8th week, Colonel Hayes called Emily into a formal meeting that included Maura Forsyth and a full colonel from the Installation Command, whose presence communicated without a single word being spoken about it, that the findings of the investigation had reached a level of seriousness requiring engagement from the highest level of base authority. The meeting lasted 94 minutes. Emily answered every question with the same careful precision she had maintained across every interview, every consultation, every formal interaction since the first day she had walked into Maura's office and asked for a timestamp. At the end of it, when the procedural questions were finished, Hayes set her legal pad down and looked at Emily directly. Carter, she said, I want to be clear about something. The strength of this investigation rests substantially on the documentation record you built from week one. The external timestamps you established through the EO office and the JAG office before the critical incident occurred. The consistency and specificity of your observations. The fact that you identified witnesses contemporaneously at the time of each incident rather than retrospectively after the investigation began. She paused. In 18 years of reviewing conduct complaints, I have rarely encountered a record of this quality produced by a professional outside the legal field. You are a recruit in basic training. What you built is by any standard I apply extraordinary. Emily held Hayes's gaze and felt the response forming with the same clarity that had shaped everything she had said throughout this process. With respect, Colonel, she said, that's the problem. If what I did was extraordinary, then the protection it produced should be considered extraordinary, which means the 7 women who came before me received a level of protection below what was required. Not because they were less capable than I am, because nobody gave them the tools before they needed them. Nobody explained the EO process in plain language during orientation. Nobody told them that a preliminary report with a timestamp existed and what it was for. Nobody made sure they knew that an external JAG consultation could create a record outside the base chain of command. She paused. What I want to know, what this investigation needs to answer, is what structural changes ensure that the next recruit doesn't have to be extraordinary to receive ordinary protection. What changes so that ordinary is enough? The room was very quiet. The installation colonel looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Emily. That, Hayes said, is the recommendation I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks writing. She made a note. Emily walked out of that meeting into the ordinary sounds of Fort Campbell, running its afternoon operations, and she stopped in the corridor and stood still for a moment and breathed. She was aware of everything that was still unresolved. The investigation was ongoing. The recommendations hadn't been written yet. Grayson's case hadn't been formally resolved. The 7 women in Hayes's file hadn't been contacted yet, as far as she knew. There was so much that hadn't happened. But something had happened. Something had been set in motion on a training field in front of 390 witnesses. Something that had moved through channels that could not be quietly intercepted, that had reached people with both the authority and the evident will to take it seriously, and it was moving now with its own momentum, independent of anything Emily needed to do to sustain it. She had built the most careful record of her life, and the record was holding. Not because she had been lucky, not because the system had spontaneously corrected itself, because she had spent 6 weeks building something that was true and thorough and impossible to simply erase, and because in the end, the truth documented with that kind of specificity and that kind of patience was very difficult for even a broken system to keep ignoring. She started walking. Behind her in offices she would never see Hayes's file was growing thicker with every hour. Statements were being processed. Records were being reviewed. 2 names from 4 years ago were being located so that someone could finally call them and say, we found it. We see what happened. You were not wrong and you were not alone, and we are sorry it took this long. And in the barracks, a 24-year-old woman who had arrived at Fort Campbell carrying grief and a penlight and a notebook was still making her rack to regulation standard every morning, still cleaning her rifle to inspection standard every night, still doing the work, still meeting the standard, still refusing to give anyone a legitimate reason for anything. Because the work was the point. Daniel had taught her that, and she was not finished yet. The recommendations took 3 weeks to write. Emily knew this because Maura told her, not officially, not as part of any formal communication, but in the quiet way that their relationship had evolved across 9 weeks of shared proximity to a difficult truth. The way 2 people who have been building something serious together sometimes simply speak to each other as human beings rather than as roles. Hayes is still writing, Maura said on a Tuesday morning in the 9th week, passing Emily in the corridor outside the administrative wing. That's a good sign. It means the scope is larger than a single finding. Emily nodded. How much larger? Maura glanced briefly at the space around them. Larger than this base, she said quietly and kept walking. Emily stood in the corridor for a moment after Maura disappeared around the corner and absorbed that, larger than this base, which meant the recommendations were not confined to Fort Campbell, which meant whatever Hayes was writing had the potential to reach every training installation that operated under the same command structure, which meant the thing Emily had set in motion on a training field in front of 390 witnesses was still moving, still traveling outward, still growing in its scope beyond anything she had mapped when she started the first page of her notebook in the dark with a pen light. She went back to training. There were 14 days left in her cycle, 14 days of PT and qualification and inspection and the physical grinding. Genuinely hard work of completing something she had started 10 weeks ago, carrying grief and a decision and not much else. She ran every morning at the standard she had maintained throughout, which by this point in training was considerably higher than the standard she had arrived with, because 10 weeks of consistent work at maximum effort had changed her body and her mind and the specific quality of her endurance in ways that she could feel but couldn't entirely measure. Patterson ran the unit with the same scrupulous fairness he had brought to every session since replacing Grayson, and Emily had come to understand that Patterson's fairness was not performed, it was constitutional, the expression of someone who had been in the Army long enough to know exactly what the institution was supposed to be and was determined to be the version of it that matched the attention rather than the failure. She respected him enormously for that. On a Thursday afternoon in the 9th week, Jordan came to her with something in his face that she recognized immediately as the specific expression he wore when he had processed information for longer than was comfortable and had finally reached the point where he needed to say it out loud. They sat in the common area after chow, and Jordan looked at the table for a moment, and then he said, "I've been thinking about what comes after this." "After training?" Emily asked. "After everything," Jordan said. "After the investigation resolves. After the recommendations are written, after we graduate and move to our assignments." He paused. "What does this mean for you long term?" Emily thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what I want it to mean. I want it to mean that the structural changes Hayes is writing actually get implemented. I want it to mean that the 2 women who filed reports 4 years ago and had them closed received something, an acknowledgement, a formal finding, some official recognition that what happened to them was real and was wrong." She paused. "Whether I'm present for any of that or whether it happens in rooms I'm not in, I don't know. I don't have control over that part." Jordan looked at her steadily. "Does that bother you?" Emily considered. "Less than I expected," she said. "I think when you do something for the right reason, the outcome being outside your control is easier to accept. If I had done this for myself, for revenge, for validation, then not being in control of how it ends would feel unbearable. But I did it for the next one. And the next one is going to exist whether I know about it or not. That's enough." Jordan was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather," he said, "used to say that the soldiers who changed things were almost never the ones who knew they were changing things while it was happening. He said the people who set out to make history usually don't. The people who just do the right thing in the right moment, those are the ones who end up mattering." Emily looked at him. "Your grandfather sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. Jordan smiled, and it was the real one. Not the easy social one he deployed for general use, but the fuller, quieter version that meant something had actually reached him. "You would have," he said. "He would have liked you too." It was on a Friday morning in the 10th week that the first twist arrived, and it arrived not through official channels, not through Mora or Hayes or Forsyth, but through a phone call that Sophie Torres received from a number she didn't recognize and whose content she brought to Emily within 20 minutes of hanging up. Sophie sat down across from Emily with the particular contained intensity of someone who is managing the size of what they know before they say it, and said, "I just got a call from a woman named Diane Walsh." Emily went completely still. "How?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the sound of her mind processing something it hadn't prepared for. "The investigation team reached out to her as part of the expanded records review," Sophie said. "She asked them if she could speak to any of the current recruits involved in the case. They gave her my number with my consent. Mora asked me 2 weeks ago if I would be willing to be contacted. I said yes. I didn't know if it would happen." Sophie paused. She's been carrying this for 18 months. She thought she quit. That's what she told herself. I quit because I wasn't strong enough. She had no idea anyone had ever looked at what happened to her and called it what it was. Emily felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated to name cleanly in the moment it was happening. She let it move through without trying to categorize it, because some things need to be felt before they can be understood. "What did she say?" Emily asked. Sophie looked at her with the specific expression of someone relaying words that cost something. She said, I want to tell the woman who stayed that I wish I had known she existed when I was there. I would have stayed too. The common area was quiet around them. Someone was moving in the corridor outside. Morning light was coming through the windows at the angle it came through at this time of day in this part of the building. All of it ordinary. All of it continuing its complete indifference to the weight of what was happening in this corner of it. Emily said, is she okay? She's better than she was, Sophie said. She said the call from the investigation team was the first time in 18 months that anyone official had said the words, what happened to you was wrong. She said she had to sit down when she heard it. Emily nodded slowly. She thought about Diane Walsh sitting down when she heard those words. She thought about what 18 months of carrying the wrong story about yourself felt like, the story that said, I quit, I wasn't strong enough. I didn't belong, when the true story was, I was pushed out by a system that had been pushing people out for 4 years and nobody caught it. She thought about the difference between those two stories and what it cost a person to live inside the wrong one. She's going to submit a statement, Sophie said, for the formal record. She contacted a JAG attorney on her own after the call. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second, then she opened them. Good, she said quietly. That's exactly right. The second twist came 8 days later, on the Thursday of the 10th week, 4 days before graduation. Emily was called into Hayes's office at 0800 hours, and when she arrived, Hayes was already present along with the Forsyth, and a woman Emily had never seen, a civilian in professional clothing, who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Odom from the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. Emily sat down and understood immediately from the composition of the room that this was a different kind of meeting than anything that had preceded it. Hayes began. The formal findings of the investigation have been completed, she said. I want to walk you through them before they enter the official record, because you are the primary complainant and you are entitled to that. Emily nodded. Sergeant Michael Grayson has been found in violation of multiple regulations governing instructor conduct, including the physical contact incident during formation, the pattern of differential treatment documented across your training cycle, and the use of fabricated evaluation language, the template across multiple recruit cycles spanning 4 years. Hayes paused. His separation from the Army is being processed. Emily absorbed this without outward reaction. She had prepared herself for various possible outcomes, including this one, and she had decided weeks ago that her response to this specific outcome would be stillness, not satisfaction, not relief, not triumph, just stillness, because the outcome had never been the point. The point was what had changed going forward. The 2 recruits who filed reports 4 years ago, Emily said, Walsh and Paulette Moreno, Hayes said. Yes, both cases have been formally reopened and findings issued. Both women are being contacted with official communications from the Army, acknowledging the failure and how their complaints were handled. Emily exhaled slowly. There's more, Hayes said and glanced at Dr. Odom. Odom leaned forward slightly. My office has been tasked with reviewing the training intake process at Fort Campbell and 7 additional installations, she said. Specifically, we are looking at how recruits are informed of their rights and options regarding conduct complaints during the initial orientation period. She paused. The finding you're finding effectively, and I want to be direct about that, is that recruits are not given sufficient operational information about the EO process, the JAG consultation option, or the value of contemporaneous documentation during their initial orientation. They are told the process exists. They are not told how to use it before they need it. Emily looked at Odom steadily. That's exactly the gap, she said. Yes, Odom said, and we are now working on a revised orientation protocol that addresses it directly. Plain language explanation of the preliminary report process. Explanation of the external timestamp mechanism. Clear information about the JAG consultation option and what it does and doesn't initiate. She paused. We are also examining whether a standardized contemporaneous documentation resource, essentially a structured template for recruits to record observations, not unlike what you created for yourself, should be provided as part of standard orientation materials. Emily felt something shift in her chest. A template. Not the malicious kind, not the copy-paste instrument of removal that Grayson had used against 7 women. A different kind of template. One designed to put into the hands of every recruit what Emily had built for herself from nothing, from Daniel's advice and her own careful instincts in 45-minute sessions in the dark before the barracks woke up. "You're giving them the notebook," she said. Odom blinked slightly at the phrasing. "We're giving them the notebook," she confirmed. Emily sat in that room and felt the specific, irreversible satisfaction of understanding that the thing she had done was not going to end with her. It was going to travel. It was going to reach recruits she would never meet, in cycles she would never be part of, at installations she would never visit, and it was going to give them something she hadn't had the protection of knowing, before they needed it, how to build the record that made them harder to erase. That was the moment, not the formation, not Grayson releasing her collar, not even the formal findings being read to her in this room. This was the moment, she said very quietly. Daniel would have thought that was the right move. Hayes looked at her. "Tell me about Daniel," she said. "Not for the record, just as a human being asking another human being a question." Emily looked at Hayes, at this woman who had spent 3 weeks writing recommendations that were going to change how 7 installations operated, who had worked 18-hour days digging through 4 years of records to find the 7 names and the 2 closed reports, and the template language and the pattern underneath all of it, and she felt the particular trust that develops between people who have been on the same side of a difficult thing. "I was careful," Emily said. "That's the main thing I want people to know about him. He was careful because he genuinely loved being alive, and he took it seriously. He used to say, he said it so many times it became the kind of thing you stop hearing because you've heard it too many times. He used to say the point isn't to be the hero. The point is to make sure the next person doesn't have to be." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "He gave you good material to work with," she said. "Yeah," Emily said, "he did." She walked out of Hayes's office and stood in the corridor and did something she almost never did during the day, in a place where people could see her. She pressed her hand flat against the wall and just stood there and breathed, not managing the breath, not measuring it, just letting it happen, letting her body do the thing it had been doing through 10 weeks of this without her having to supervise it. Jordan found her there. I didn't say anything. He just stood beside her and waited until she was ready to move, because he had always known when to speak and when presence was the whole offer. After about 45 seconds, she said, "They're implementing structural changes, 7 installations, revised orientation protocol. They're giving recruits documentation resources from day 1. Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walsh, formal finding, official acknowledgement. She's submitting a statement." Jordan let out a long, slow breath. Moreno, same, another breath. Grayson, separation processing. Jordan turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. They stood in the corridor of the administrative building on a Thursday morning at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 10 weeks and 3 days after Emily Carter had walked through these gates carrying her brother's memory, and a decision she hadn't told anyone about yet. And they looked at each other with the specific, complicated expression of people who have been through something together that neither of them will ever fully be able to explain to anyone who wasn't there. "You did it," Jordan said. "We did it," Emily said. "No," he said, and he said it gently but firmly, the way someone corrects a thing they feel strongly about. You were the one who built it from nothing. You were the one who stayed when staying was the harder choice. We were beside you, but you built it." She looked at him for a moment. "Daniel built it," she said. "I just used the tools he gave me." Graduation happened on a Saturday morning. 390 recruits completed their training cycle. Emily included, with performance evaluations that reflected what she had actually produced across 10 weeks of training, written by Patterson with the specificity and fairness that characterized everything Patterson did. Her scores were strong. Her record was clean. Her evaluations contained no vague characterizations, no copy-paste template language, no references to attitude or resistant behavior. They contained documented measurements of what she had done in plain language, signed by a man who stood behind every word. She stood in the formation on graduation morning and felt the accumulated weight of 10 weeks settle into something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief, but contained all three, the specific emotional compound that comes from finishing something that cost you more than you expected and produced more than you planned. Tyler was 2 rows ahead of her. He was standing at parade rest with the particular stillness of someone who has worked something out internally and arrived at a place of genuine steadiness, not performed composure, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done, and no longer carrying the weight of the unsaid and undone. Sophie was 3 positions to Emily's right. She had the expression of someone who had discovered across the course of these 10 weeks that the instinct to document and remember and refuse to pretend you didn't see what you saw was not a liability, but a form of integrity. And that integrity applied consistently was one of the more durable things a person could build. Jordan was directly to Emily's left. He looked forward with the expression of a third-generation army man who has found something in this cycle that his grandfather and his father and his uncles couldn't have given him, because it had to be found in the specific circumstances of this specific 10 weeks. The knowledge that the institutional thing he was joining was capable of being better than its worst moments, if people inside it refused to accept the worst moments as inevitable. The ceremony ran its course. Names were called, hands were shaken. The formalities of completion were observed with the precision that military ceremonies always brought to the formalities of completion, because precision was what the institution did, and at its best, precision in service of the right things was a genuinely beautiful quality. When Emily's name was called, she walked across the space and received what was given, and walked back and stood in her position, and the only outward sign of anything she was carrying internally was a single moment, brief, visible to no one but herself, where she looked up at nothing in particular and thought, Daniel, we got here. After the formal ceremony and the ordinary dispersal of people moving toward the next thing, something happened that Emily had not planned for and could not have planned for. Derek Okafor found her first. He had graduated 2 weeks earlier at the end of his cycle and had come back not because anyone asked him to, not because the ceremony required his presence, but simply because he felt he owed it to himself to be there. I needed to see you finish, he said. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Emily looked at him. Thank you for coming back, she said. Thank you for staying, he said. You gave a lot of people something they didn't know they needed. Then Marcus Webb, who shook her hand and said, I wrote to Diane Walsh. We've been emailing. She's doing better. She's thinking about reapplying. He paused. She said the thing that's making her think about it is knowing that the process is different now, that the orientation is going to be different, that someone already built the path. Emily felt that settle somewhere deep. Tell her, Emily said, that whoever comes through after her is going to have it easier because of what she went through, that her experience is part of what changed this, that she matters to the record even though she didn't stay. Tell her that. Marcus nodded. I will, he said. I'll tell her exactly that. Then Sophie, who hugged her briefly and without ceremony and said, my notebook is in the formal record. That means part of what I saw is officially real now. I don't have a word for what that is. It's enough, Emily said. Whatever word it needs, it's enough. Tyler came last. He stood in front of her with his hands quiet at his sides and his expression carrying the complexity of someone who has completed a thing that changed them in ways they are still taking inventory of. I called my dad last night, he said. Emily waited. I told him everything, the whole 10 weeks. Walsh Moreno, the template. Hayes, the orientation changes all of it. Tyler paused. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. And then he said, that's the story I needed to hear 20 years ago. That's the story that would have changed what I believed about whether any of it was worth it. He stopped. He said to thank you. I told him I'd pass it along. Emily looked at Tyler Chen and felt something that was specifically and irreducibly about the distance a single act of documented truth could travel backward into the past, where a man in his 60s was re-examining 20 years of belief forward into a future where orientation protocols at 7 installations were going to reach recruits who hadn't yet enlisted sideways through a formation of people who had stood on a training field and chosen not to look away. Tell your dad, Emily said, that he raised someone who stayed when it was easier to leave. That matters more than the 20 years. Tell him that. Tyler's composure shifted slightly, just slightly, the specific shift of someone who has held a great deal carefully for a long time and been given for one moment permission to feel the weight of it. I'll tell him, he said. Then Jordan came, and he came with the ease of someone who doesn't need a formal moment to say a formal thing, and he just stood beside her in the ordinary way he had stood beside her across 10 weeks and said, where are you assigned? She told him. He nodded. I'm 3 hours from there, he said. My grandfather is buried about 45 minutes from your base. He paused. I go every 6 months. Next time I go, if you're not deployed, come with me. I want to tell him what happened here. I think he'd want to know. Emily thought about sitting beside a grave in a veterans cemetery in Georgia and telling a man she had never met the story of a notebook and a penlight in 390 witnesses in a system that had finally imperfectly haltingly begun to look at itself. Yes, she said, I'll be there. That evening, Emily sat alone in the emptying barracks. Her rack stripped her gear, packed her time at Fort Campbell, measurable now in hours rather than weeks, and she opened her notebook for the last time. Not to document, not to record, just to hold it for a moment and understand what it was. It was 112 pages of dated factual witness truth. It was the counter record that had outlasted the record built against her. It was the thing that had made her harder to erase and had ultimately, through Hayes's file and Odom's protocols and Walsh's reopened case and Moreno's acknowledgement and the revised orientation that 7 installations were now preparing to implement, made a great many other people harder to erase as well. Well, it was Daniel's advice made material. She thought about him clearly and without the particular grief weight that his memory had carried for 2 years, because something about completing this had shifted the way she carried him. He was still loss, he was still absence, he was still the person she would have called first if calling him had been possible, but he was also now something that had moved through her and outward into the world. Something that had reached 7 installations and 2 women who finally had their cases reopened, and 390 witnesses who had chosen not to look away, and a Staff Sergeant Daniels who had finally said out loud what he had seen, and a Tyler Chen whose father had re-examined 20 years of belief in a single phone call. Daniel had traveled farther than she had expected. She wrote for the last time in the notebook, "We did what you said. I made sure people knew I was here. And then something I didn't expect happened. Other people made sure they were here too. Jordan and Sophie and Tyler and Marcus and Derek and Walsh and Moreno and Mora and Hayes and Odom and Daniel and 390 people who stood on a field and didn't look away. You taught me one thing and it built a record, and the record built a case, and the case built structural change, and the structural change is going to travel to places I will never go and reach people I will never meet." That's what you said the point was. Not to be the hero, to make sure the next person doesn't have to be. I think we did that. She paused. Then she wrote one final line. "The uniform doesn't make someone powerful. The choices they make while wearing it do. I know that now in a way I didn't know it when I arrived. I know it because I watched someone try to use that uniform as a weapon against people he had decided were beneath it, and I watched that fail not because he wasn't powerful, not because the system was perfect, but because one person decided to write everything down and refused to stop." She closed the notebook. She put it in her bag. She stood up. Emily Carter, 24 years old, trained soldier, builder of records, keeper of Daniel's advice holder of 390 witness moments, walked out of the barracks at Fort Campbell, Kentucky into the evening, carrying everything she had arrived with and considerably more. Besides, and the thing she carried most carefully and most completely, was the knowledge that the truth documented with patience and specificity and the particular stubborn refusal to let it be erased was one of the most durable things a human being could build. And that a person who refuses to be broken does not merely survive the thing that tried to break them. They become the reason the next person doesn't have to face it alone.